All right. Well, hello and welcome to the Madison Grace podcast. I'm Dr. Matthew Stanford, and with me is my co-host, Dr. Madeline Stiers. How are you today, Maddie?
Good. How are you doing?
I'm doing all right. Um, this topic that we're going to talk about today really kind of came to mind because I was just having some conversations with different individuals over the last couple of weeks, and they just really seem to not have a real good sense of that mental health is really more than the absence of mental illness, and that they really kind of saw it as two things. So today we're going to talk about really what is mental health, and mental health is indeed far more than just not having a mental illness. And really, in their conceptualization, and I understand why. I think it's kind of how it's presented to us in the media and in different things is that people that have mental illness or a mental disorder, might we say, they don't have good mental health. And then
Right.
we just kind of think there's everybody else. And so it's like two buckets, don't be in the disorder bucket, be in the health bucket.
Yeah, I think people hear mental health and think like that means you have a mental illness or you are not doing well.
Right.
But when physical health, we don't think, oh, that means bad, but
Right. Absolutely. You don't, we do use the term mental health and mental illness interchangeably.
Mhm.
But we don't, you're right. We don't use physical health that way. In any sense, but
Right.
I guess physical health, I guess you don't say you're physically unhealthy, you say you're ill. And we obviously say mental illness, but I'm not sure how we got to this point where we use it interchangeably. So having said all that, let me just kind of throw out a definition of mental health and just kind of give a little bit more of a context for it. And we can kind of talk through that. So really, when we're talking about mental health, I mean, we're talking about a continuum or a spectrum, and so on one end of the continuum, you'd have kind of well-being, or maybe you'd say health. And on the other end, you'd have illness, and so we're all on the continuum and we're all moving back and forth on the continuum. Same thing with physical health. But when we talk about being mentally healthy, and I think a lot of times these days we use the term mental wellness or mental well-being, we're really talking about being able to cope with stressors in life, having some aspect of resiliency, meaning we can kind of bounce back from problems or difficult circumstances, that we can learn effectively. We can acquire new information and inform memories. And I also think that we have some ability to control our emotions or our feelings, that we don't just kind of we're just not all over the place. We're somewhat in control of our emotions. What do you think about that? What would you add to that, if anything?
Yeah, I think regulating not just your emotions, but
Mhm.
also your thoughts, so your cognitions, like what's going on inside your head internally, your internal dialogue, all of that. And then also your behaviors, right? So they
Right,
all,
right.
we think of the cognitive triangle, they all play. But really being mentally well, like your mental health means not only the absence of a diagnosis or a disorder, but it's that you have these coping skills that help you regulate your thoughts, your emotions, or your feelings, and your behaviors that help you function and well in society.
Absolutely. And I think that all those things that I just said, all those things you just said, are literally things that we all do every day, and we give
Hopefully.
no conscious thought to. We get regulating your emotions, regulating your thoughts, formulating memories, these things that we do every day, and we don't give a lot of conscious thought to it. So I think a lot of times people just kind of forget about, well, that's the healthy or the well aspect of mental
So
health. And so,
I say that all the time to
right,
people that we're working with in our programs here at the Hope and Healing Center and Institute. What's the difference between someone who looks like they may not struggle with their emotions or their thoughts or their behaviors and someone who is it's very clear that they're struggling with that? So what's the difference? And they go, well, those people aren't. And I'm like, no, they are. Everyone, all day, every day, we have to regulate our thoughts. We have to regulate our emotions and our behaviors. Otherwise, we just live in this really chaotic world,
right.
But it's the difference is people have been taught coping skills and regulation techniques and how to
Right.
manage them. People that we work with that come into our programs maybe haven't been modeled those. And so,
Right.
anyways, jump
Well,
in and say
and with physical health, I think that we certainly, and this kind of gets a little bit to the second question here, the side that we're working on here, this idea of kind of misconceptions, or maybe I would just say maybe context as well in the context of mental health, of misconceptions about it. I think with physical health, you really think that there's, or I shouldn't say think. I think most people understand or recognize that there's something they can do about that. They may or may not do it,
sure.
but they know that there are things they can do. They could eat healthier, they could exercise, they could take vitamins. If your arm is slashed open and before it gets all infected, you can clean it out and go to a doctor, and you can take antibiotics and whatever. I mean, so there are things that you can do, and I think generally people in the population recognize that. I think with mental health, I think people just kind of, again, get back to this kind of two bucket idea. And that is, as long as I'm not diagnosed with a mental disorder, well, then I'm okay.
Mhm.
And not realizing that their mental health might be pretty poor. And so, one of the things I would say in the context of misconceptions is what I said before. And that is, you could be out there right now and not meet criteria for a mental illness, and you could have very, very bad, very poor mental health. In fact, you would be deemed unhealthy from a mental perspective.
Sure.
And
Absolutely.
and I
Totally.
think that that's something people don't think about. They think, oh, well, I'm good. I don't have schizophrenia. I don't, I don't have bipolar disorder. So I have mental health. When, but I also would say there's, just like with physical health, I don't think that there's anyone who couldn't improve their mental health.
It's a daily thing. I mean, just like physical health, where you make choices eat and how active you are, and to not engage in behaviors that are going to put you in physical harm's way. I mean, it's the same thing with mental health. Is every day we have to make the decision and the choices to work towards a healthy mental state, right? Whether
Right.
that's how we're interacting with people, or deciding to see a doctor or a therapist, or just learning the tools to regulate, and navigate the thoughts that are in our heads and our emotions. We're taught in school all the time what's healthy food, what's unhealthy food, how to be physically active. We
Right.
don't kids, hey, when these thoughts and feelings come up, this is how you navigate them or negate them if they're not super helpful. And
Right.
so it is an everyday conscious effort that a lot of us just don't have the tools for.
Absolutely. And I know you and I've had this conversation, and I know the clinicians in our clinic, they often work with our clients on this, but it's surprising to me, and I know you as well, that how often you find people that really struggle with even identifying the emotions that they're expressing or feeling, that it's almost like no one ever taught them what different emotions are.
Absolutely. We get big bucket emotion words, right? So I'm sad. Okay, that's helpful. We're getting somewhere, but what does that sadness look like? Is it grief? Is it, sorrow? Is it despair? Is it depression? Like what? Like let's get a little more specific. This is when we talk about the emotion wheel and the emotion charts that we have. But yeah,
Right.
people really struggle to identify, and some people can't even get to the kind of big bucket emotions. They're like, I don't really know. I just am overwhelmed. And overwhelmed isn't an emotion.
Right.
That's a
And if
number.
people are struggling with something that most people would consider, again, most people would consider that a rather simple task, although they may not even do it well themselves, because, like you said, they may use the big, broad stroke words. Uh, if they struggle with that, I mean, how much more are they struggling with, things like resiliency, bouncing back from difficult circumstances? I think it's interesting that this is something we never check. I mean, many people, even people who are not particularly physically healthy or really into their physical health, will go to a doctor regularly. They will go for a yearly checkup. Uh, but I would say most people in our society will try to live their entire life and never have a conversation with a mental health professional ever, for any reason.
Yeah.
You know,
One of
and that seems a little odd, if because you leave it up to yourself. I guess I would put it in this context. If it was left up to you to make a determination every year whether you were physically healthy or not, would you do that? Because it's certainly what we do with mental health. So let's jump to this next one. I think we've started to touch on some of this stuff, and that is, how do factors like genetics, environment, or upbringing kind of influence our mental health, or where we are on that kind of mental health continuum?
Yeah, I mean, they have huge impacts on our mental health. Talking about our upbringing, I was kind of touched on that earlier, right? If our caregivers or the people, the adults around us, are not modeling, good coping skills, and they don't have, their mental health is not well, it's unlikely that you're going to pick up on ways to navigate the world that promote positive or healthy mental status. And it especially so, even if there's the absence of that growing up, if you have like invalidation or abuse going on at home, I mean, your upbringing is really absolutely going to impact your mental health even more in that sense, in a very negative way. So that's your upbringing, and then your environment, your upbringing can dictate how you choose friends, how you choose relationships, and if they're,
Right.
it just kind of becomes this onward trajectory of unhealthy relationships and behaviors and coping skills, and I think
And it all works together. It's a very complex interaction. So, you mentioned all these upbringing issues that then start to bleed into environmental things like abuse or, poverty, stuff like that. But then, also our genetics, our biology. If any of you are out there and you have children, I mean, one child is born and I mean, they're not really sensitive to the environment. They're not very easily startled. They can kind of just, they're not an anxious child. You have another child that any noise sets them off. I mean, so there's a lot of variability in, say, temperament, which is kind of that underlying kind of foundation for what will become our emotions, and a lot of that's biologically based. And then how that then drives you to respond to the environment, how that drives you to respond to how you're being, say, disciplined or raised, and then put yourself in a situation where you have a lot of very negative circumstances like poverty or whatever. If you don't have that model to walk you through and show you, well, this is a very difficult situation, and it is aversive. It doesn't feel good, but we can live beyond this. This is what we can do. This is how we're going to cope with this. This is how we're going to deal with this. These are the steps we're going to take to try to move ahead and have this not happen again. I mean, we need that as we're growing up. And I think one of the things I've seen, certainly over the last generation, but maybe even two generations almost worth of people, is, children that were not prepared to be resilient to any kind of negative circumstance, and to have very blunted emotional responses, either extreme, on either end of the, extremes of emotion. And, certainly some of that is associated with social media, which makes us think that we are interacting with people, but you lose that kind of sense of body language and emotional content. And, I mean, we think that, someone's yelling at us when they use all capital letters, I mean, that's not the same thing as when someone's really yelling at you, and what are they, how are they yelling at you, and what do they look like when they're yelling at you, and what was before they started yelling at you, and how, and so you need all that context to try to evaluate that. And then what's the appropriate response? And so, all of this has to do with mental health. And ultimately, as a person, struggles with mental health issues, at whatever level that is, it starts to impact, say, relationships. And relationships are one of the things that keeps us probably the most mentally healthy, but there also can be one of the things that damages us from a mental health perspective. And so, with mental health, when your mental health begins to decline, one of the first things I see is people starting to isolate themselves.
And we were created for relationship.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think
So,
relationships are what help you kind of move back on that mental health continuum towards the well-being side when you're starting to struggle, but isolation becomes kind of the default when you are struggling, and then that just causes you decline even more. So what about the interaction, say, between physical health and mental health? I've seen a little bit about that more often these days. What kind of things have you seen, or what are you telling our clients in relationship to that?
They're not related at all. No, I'm joking. Obviously they are. I mean, it's not as simple to say just eat better and you'll feel better. It's not
Right.
as simple to say like go outside for a walk, get some sun, and your depression or your bipolar disorder will go away. It's not that simple, right? And I think a lot of people will kind of narrow it down to that. But the reality is that if we're eating well, if we're taking care of ourselves physically, our emotional and mental health is likely to do better. Now, that's not the case in every way, and which comes first, the chicken or the egg, right? Is oftentimes the question, but they are connected. Even if I'm not clinically depressed, if I don't have this diagnosis, I know that if I'm laying around all day, I might feel like, just kind of lower, like what have I been doing? Like I just kind of feeling lazy today. And for someone who may not be diagnosed with a mental illness, like that makes me feel like not so great, right? So if you've got someone who does have a diagnosis of a mental health issue, and they're not taking care of themselves, it is yeah going to exacerbate those symptoms, and doesn't really work towards mental health
Right,
actually.
absolutely. And I know that, for instance, when we're working with our clients that have serious mental health problems, it's not uncommon for us to use kind of how they're taking care of themselves as a measure
Mm.
of of how their pathology is progressing or recovering. And certainly, if we want to really get into the kind of medical side of mental health issues, then we can say that there are absolutely physical health problems, which I consider mental illness a physical health problem. But let's just forget that for a moment. I mean, things like thyroid issues, or there's certainly kind of blood chemistry problems, or neurotransmitter issues. These are physical problems that can lead to kind of, uh, you know, at least problems that may appear to be of mental health origin when they, are really more. So, a lot of times I would recommend that a client go and get a complete physical with blood work before they really began any kind of mental health type of intervention, because that just helps rule that out. The other thing is, if you have somebody come in and they, uh, let's say that they eat horribly, they're significantly overweight, they have diabetes, so they're struggling with some kidney issues. I mean, well, I'd be surprised if that person had good mental health
Health,
for
yeah.
a lot of reasons, not just the fact that they're physically unhealthy, but they might also have very low self-esteem. They also may feel rejected. They may struggle with maintaining a job because of their physical health, which causes them to become somewhat depressed. I mean, it all just kind of works together. And so by helping that individual become more physically healthy, you're also helping them become more mentally healthy. And I think to just focus on their mental health and ignore their physical health problems is really to ignore a part of the person that's so integrated together. And I just see that in our system today. We look at those things as almost that they're two different things.
Yeah, and it goes back to what we talked about last week on the podcast, is this holistic approach to
Right.
health care, not just physical, but also, mental health and spiritual health and relational health. And how can we look at the person and go, from a holistic standpoint, all of these things are important and they do interact and feed from one another, and uh, really take an approach that takes that into account and
Right.
doesn't count apart one of those because it's too hard or
Right.
it's just not the primary focus, right?
So, if you're out there and you're listening, I mean, I think one of the take home messages today is, your mental health can be better than it is today, regardless of who you are. And your mental health could be in decline and you not have a mental illness. And so a couple more questions. One here that I think's particularly important to us here on the podcast is, what is the role of faith in shaping our mental health. I mean, certainly if we look at the research literature, if we just look at something simple like where they've gone through and they've looked at people that are actively involved in a faith community, you find that people that are actively involved in a faith community have better physical health, that they tend to be more physically healthy. They also tend to have better mental health. They tend to report less depression, less anxiety, things like that. It's not to say that, if you're struggling with your mental health out there, the thing you need to do is just go out and start attending a church. But I mean, what it does say is that those individuals that are involved in those communities tend to be more physically and mentally healthy on average. Doesn't mean that people that are in those places don't have mental illness. Doesn't mean those people don't have physical illnesses. But on average, and certainly, there's an aspect of that, if you just think about it for a moment, that helps you understand. Well, it's probably very much related in one aspect to the community. If you're actively involved, you're connected to a community of like-minded individuals that have been called to care for one another, so you have support around you. I think you also could say that because you believe in a higher power and God that's involved, and particularly what our research shows, particularly if you believe that God is engaged in your daily life, then I think it's a stress reducer, because you don't have to be responsible for everything. You can kind of turn things over. And what's interesting is that when that research is done where they take into account positive behaviors, meaning that, a lot of faith communities don't like their members to smoke, don't like their members to use alcohol, don't like those types of things. Some people might say, well, that's the reason, Baptists are healthier because they don't drink alcohol and they don't dance, or whatever, and so, but the reality is that can be taken into account. And sure enough, that's not really what drives that difference. It's just involvement. And really, you find that in most faith communities. There's only a few versions or a few faith traditions where you don't find that kind of positive, type of physical and mental health. And so it's very interesting to see that, because, a lot of times I'll say, when parents will say, well, what are the things that I can do to help my child be less likely to have a mental health problem? And one of the things I always say is help them develop an active spiritual life, because that's what the research shows. What are some things that you've seen in your research or with your clients in relationship to faith in the context of being more mentally healthy?
Well, in the context of being more mentally healthy, in sessions, I practice as a therapist. When we're working with our clients, opening the door to having the conversation about faith, their religious beliefs, whatnot, ultimately has an impact on their mental health, because we have people that will come in and say, absolutely do not want to talk about this. No way. Absolutely not. And those people have usually been hurt in some form or fashion by either a faith community or leaders in those communities, or just, have encountered some unfortunate aspect of religion or their spiritual beliefs. But once they start talking about it, and once a person is open to really kind of understanding how faith does play a role in their life, even if they're kind of rejecting it right now, we see how it connects with their mental health in a way of, like, whether it's causing pain or has the potential to bring joy and connection. Really, it's important to have those conversations with your clients or in session with your therapist, to really talk about how those two interact, how this specific individual, how their faith plays into their mental health in a positive or negative way. So you kind of talked about the research areas of it and what we know on average, but as for those of you who are listening, as a client, if you're talking with your therapist and if they haven't asked you, bring it up. I want to talk about my faith. I want to talk about my spiritual beliefs. Using that as a pillar for strength and support in your life, or has it been, something that you feel like you've been knocked down a little bit, and maybe there's some pain there and you want to get back to it and you want to address that. Obviously your therapist or whoever you're working with can absolutely help address some of that. So.
Absolutely. Well, and in closing, in this last little part here, let's talk a little bit about kind kind of just some thoughts on how a person might kind of take an inventory of their mental health, but really from the context of, well, how would I determine if my mental health was good or bad, or how I could determine if maybe my mental health was getting better? I mean, one of the things I would say, just kind of little simple things, is looking at how you respond to stress. Stress comes at different levels. So if, when do you fall apart? I mean, would the average person that you know or have heard of or experienced, would they have fallen apart at that? And so what is it that happens when you get stressed out? What is it that you do to try to help yourself maintain control and move beyond that? How is it that you cope? You have to be very honest. So just to kind of give you a very simple example, when you get stressed out, do you go home and eat a gallon of or a half gallon of Bluebell ice cream? Does that make you feel better? And so now the thing is that I know people that do that, and that's the coping strategy they use. Now that's a negative coping strategy because that's going to put weight on you and cause all kind of problems over time. But it's a strategy. We all do it. So be very honest with yourself and say, how do I handle stress? Now, stress happens to everybody, and I'm not talking about an overwhelming stressful situation. I'm not talking about, you were in a car accident and you lost 3 of your family members. I mean, that's overwhelming and everyone's going to need help for that. I'm talking about you have a bad day at work, that type of thing. I'm talking somebody cuts you off on the way to the grocery store. Those, the stressful events that we deal with all the time. How do you deal with those? Do you think you deal with those in a healthy way? And are you able to bounce back from them relatively quickly? And so that's one I would throw out. What's something that you might throw out to someone to think about?
I think asking yourself how you navigate stress or unpleasant situations, but also maybe asking a trusted loved one, because sometimes we don't have the best, especially if our mental health is not doing great. We might not have the best insight or look at ourselves in that moment. So asking someone who you trust.
That's a great idea. Yeah. Kind of
whether that's a therapist or a friend
another set of eyes.
Someone else in your community. Yeah. But stress is usually the place where I go to. One of the things that I'll say is I ask people a lot, like, what are things that you enjoy doing that bring you joy? Are you doing them? And if not, what stopped you? Like, if you used to do them and something has changed, like, what's caused this change, right? Because if there's a point in time where work has become so overwhelming that, like, we are now just so stressed and we're not doing anything that we enjoy. Oftentimes, we may not be in the midst of an extreme, terribly bad mental health episode, but we just start to decline a little by little, and things fall off and we don't even realize that. So have we stopped doing the things that we don't necessarily put on our schedule, on our calendar? We put our meetings, we put our appointments, like we had this podcast on our calendar for today, all the things that we have to do. But you don't necessarily put, like, stand up and call a family member, just to tell them that you love them, or, get outside and go ride my bike because I enjoy being out in the sunshine in the park. So those things. I think
you make a good point there that, this really is something that is gradual, and the decline is gradual. And a lot of times you don't recognize it at the beginning. Mm-hmm. And that's why it's something you really need to deal with every day. Well, and physical health can be very gradual as well. But when things start hurting, you usually go to the doctor. And so, and you make a good point about the kind of like, you're talking about a range of experiences. And you could even think about that as in the context of, say, a range of emotions. So one of the things I would say is that, to kind of think about how you might measure that, if you're, as you said, look at the things you do. Are you doing a range of things? So the obligations, going to work, doing those things of enjoyment, things of connection and community. Are you doing a lot of things across a week, across a month? And I would also add, are you expressing a range of emotions?
Mm.
while you're doing those or across a period of time. So do you find that you basically express the same emotion every day, all day, 7 days a week, 30 days a month? You're just kind of always down. And people I'm talking about, those we see people like that all the time. They don't have a range of emotions. They can't tell you the last time they were happy. They only
Yeah.
tell you when they're sad or down. So that's another thing I would think about is, a range of, like you said, a range of experiences of from joy to, even dealing with the obligations, the boring obligations you have to, and expressing a range of emotion. I think a final thing I would say is look at your relationships or the lack thereof, potentially. If people that have good mental health are able to form healthy relationships. And when I say healthy relationship, I mean a relationship where certainly relationships are going to vary. You're going to have some friends you feel like you can share anything with, and other ones you're more guarded with. But you have relationships where you feel like you are supported and you're cared for. There's trust. You can share your feelings and that's accepted and received, and you receive positive encouragement and feedback from that. And that's not just family members, that would be friends as well. So do you have those relationships? If you don't have those relationships, you should ask yourself why you don't have those relationships, because people who have those relationships have better mental health. And there's a weird relationship between that and having those relationships. People who don't have good mental health oftentimes don't have healthy relationships.
And
And
how do you develop healthy relationships if you're not?
right. And so it's a hand in hand kind of a thing. So, you want to, that's another way I think you can kind of measure what's going on with your mental health. And not that you have to have 100 friends that you feel like you can go share anything with, but do you have one friend that you feel like you can go share anything with? And do you maintain relationships? I know a lot of people will tell me, "Oh yeah, I meet people all the time." Well, do you ever meet them again? I mean, so you meet them once and you talk to them, and then you never, do you form and maintain relationships, or are people just kind of a throwaway for you, and you find yourself more isolated than,
What is the quality of those relationships? Are they,
exactly. Right.
you
And
know?
are they healthy for you? Because
Mhm.
relationships can also damage your mental health if you have unhealthy relationships. People who are abusive towards you, or who are degrading or shameful, minimizing, things like that. And so we have to be wary of that. So looking at the health of your relationships is not only a good metric for yourself, but also a good metric to see if you're receiving kind of negative experiences from the environment that maybe damage your mental health. Well, thanks, Maddie. Thanks for having this conversation today. I think that this is one of those where you could just kind of talk about it forever. I think the big takeaway, though, is that mental health is a spectrum, and we're all on it. And we got to stop thinking about it as just if I don't have mental illness, I got mental health, because I see people every day that are pretty miserable. And I don't think that they realize that there's a better way they could live. I think they just kind of think, well, everybody's miserable. That's just
Yeah,
how it
life is
is.
hard.
Life is hard. And you know what? Life is hard, but you can still be happy. But there are some things you need to do. So thanks for joining us today on Madness and Grace, and we will be back with you soon.